You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're joined by Dr. Brandon Ito, a psychiatrist, educator, and advocate specializing in LGBTQ+ mental health and reducing healthcare disparities. As a UCLA health and leader in medical education, Dr. Ito is dedicated to fostering inclusive and equitable care. Today, we'll explore the intersection of diverse identities within the autism community, focusing on sexual and gender diversity and the mental health disparities many face. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Brandon Ito.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I appreciate you coming on, and you have a specialty, the niche that hopefully you're able to educate the audience and myself on. But I'd love to get the backstory. Is what sparked your interest in autism, and what led to this particular topic being something of so much importance for you?
That's a great question. I would say I stumbled upon this topic, this community, a little bit by accident. So before medical school, I did childcare for a number of years. I did elementary school after school care. I did preschool childcare, and so I was always around children. I was always drawn to the children who were unique, who were maybe a little bit quirky, like myself. But when I got into medical school and training, they don't do a lot of training in medical school about working with communities or working with individuals who have autism. So even after my child fellowship, even after my child training, it was an area that I felt, I would say, less knowledgeable about. Luckily, when I landed at UCLA, I was put in our child and adult neurodevelopmental clinic, focusing on kids with neurodevelopmental disorders and autism. And over the past 10 years, it's kind of become a love and a passion of mine working with these communities. The second part being the LGBTQ community is something I had always been interested in and focused on, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Over time, these two worlds incidentally came together and started crossing over, and suddenly it did become this community population, which I happen to have expertise in both areas, which has been a wonderful journey for me.
No, and it's needed. I think it was just a few days ago, I was in a conversation and we were talking about the education for physicians and in the medical world in general around autism, around
Right.
understanding kind of the unique perspectives that an autistic individual might bring, and in providing care to an autistic individual. We're going to go down and dive deep into the LGBTQ plus community, but you brought up the thought of, there's a lack of education that's going on from the beginning of training for pediatricians. Can you give me a little bit of a better understanding of that? Because I know it's changed over the years. I know that it's crept in and become almost part of the training curriculum, but has it really been supported in the way that you'd imagine?
I think you're right. I think with the increase in diagnoses, increase in awareness about autism, the increase in screening, especially among primary care, I definitely think there's been more of a focus in training. The part of the issue, both within the autism community, but also within the LGBTQ community, is how do we teach these things without falling back on cliches or stereotypes? So I'll give you an example. So all of my teaching on LGBTQ care in medical school was largely contained within sexual transmitted diseases. So it is important because that's the section in school that talks about sexuality, it talks about sexual behaviors. However, it kind of created this link born out of the HIV pandemic, in which LGBT and STIs were inherently linked within medicine. And so what we're trying to do, especially at the UCLA Medical School, is trying to decouple that and
Mhm.
understand, yes, we need to identify all of the risk factors and all of the risky behaviors. And there's so much more a part of the community and so many other ways that we can intervene and help needs that the community needs aside from just STI testing.
Absolutely. And I think that your approach to just even thinking through that topic is one that I wish others would kind of encompass. The idea that if you don't stick to the very narrow questions or the very narrow thought processes that we have about specific people, identities, conditions, and we actually start asking broader questions, is that we probably end up getting to more understanding over time because we're looking at the holistic, the totality of an individual and of a population. So I love the way that you approach that. So how did your training in both topics lead you to say, this is where I'm dedicating myself right now? I know that you said there's a gap in knowledge out there, but what do you think might need to change?
Oof, there's a lot of things that need to change. I think that one of the most important things that needs to change, which I think is already happening, is just an awareness and an understanding of the fact that gender identity, gender diversity, neurodiversity, that these two things do overlap. Another issue within medicine is that different specialties and different topics tend to be siloed. And so for a very long time, you had the clinicians who were focused on children, neurodevelopmental disorders, and then you had the clinicians who are focused on LGBTQ health, and they really weren't overlapping very much. And so what I saw was that patients, families, they were kind of having to navigate two different environments, and there really wasn't anybody putting them together. And
Hmm.
so I think with the increasing awareness, especially individuals who work closely with the autism community, I think there's been a huge jump in awareness about gender diversity, about sexual diversity, that I think the autism community is probably working 5 steps ahead than the LGBTQ community is on understanding neurodiversity.
Yeah, and can you give me a little bit of a better understanding? And numbers
Sure.
speak, is that I've seen percentages out there. I've seen how there's a larger proportion when you're looking at percentages of people that identify autistic that maybe have identified or currently identify as gender have gender diversity or have sexual diversity as far as their identities go. And maybe informing and helping us to paint that picture at first might help why this is so important that we're talking about these two things together.
Sure. Well, speaking about the numbers, so when we look at the prevalence of autism within the community, there's a huge range. 1 in 64, maybe that's, a average of the ranges that's been put out there. Some more, some less. When we look at the number of individuals, especially children who identify as trans or non-binary, that number is astronomically small. There's been a lot of focus on kids who are identifying as trans. Even with that, even with the increase in the number is very, very small. So speaking of epidemiology, so if we
Mhm.
have two rare events, the chance that these two rare events coincide with each other should be extremely, extremely rare. What we started to see within the numbers, within the literature, is that again, we have a huge range, but somewhere between 1% up to 12% of individuals, either with autism or either presenting to gender clinics, were having this overlap of symptoms. And so if we think of, it should be one in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, but when we're hitting 1 to 12%, it's telling us there's something there. There's been a lot of thought about what is causing this overlap, or what is the reason for this overlap? Um, I think in some ways medicine has focused more on that question than individuals in the community may care about. And so there's all these theories. There's cognitive theories, there's genetic theories, there's all of these different theories. For me, one of the ideas that makes the most sense is that individuals who have been diagnosed with autism, some of the social rules that we abide by, we meaning individuals who don't identify as part of the community, um, just don't make sense. And I think that is something that I've learned over time, which is we have certain gender roles, we have certain gender expectations, and when you really step back and think about them, um, it's not really clear why those were started in the first place. And I think it's changed my thinking on how I think about gender. And so I think part of the overlap is because it's a different way of thinking that just
Mhm.
points out, things that don't make sense within the way we do things every day in our day-to-day lives.
Absolutely. And oftentimes is that these things, as you're navigating that journey, as you're navigating the journey of understanding autism, even as being autistic and understanding, this is the way I perceive something. Somebody else might perceive it differently. This is the
Mhm.
way that the social rules have been built. This is the way I see social rules. It sometimes creates mental health disparities. It creates barriers within the community one might be living in. And when I'm thinking about just in general, as oftentimes is that the treatment when you're working with somebody who's autistic and they've come for support, it oftentimes turns into I'm going to tell you what you should do. I'm going to tell you what you should think because there aren't a lot of clinicians that have the skill set to be able to really help support a diverse perspective or somebody who might be thinking differently than them in the way that they're processing things. But then also you take the idea of gender identity, you take the idea of sexual identity, and now it becomes even more of a challenge because you have two different therapist skill sets as far as helping somebody navigate personal thought and while trying to also navigate how do I work around the social conditions. So what do you see as the biggest disparities when you're talking about autistic individuals that identify as LGBTQ, as far as their mental health concerns might go and processing so many challenging things?
Great question. When I think, so if we look across the board in terms of mental health disparities, just within the LGBTQ community, it's the risk of any sort of diagnosis, depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance use, they're all unfortunately elevated. And I'll go back to a little bit of a reason why. Similarly, within the community, within the autistic community, higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety. It's impossible to separate out how much of this is biologic, meaning how much of this is driven by genes, how much of this is driven by neurotransmitters, and how much of it is driven by the social environment that we live in. And so there's a couple of ways to think about it. So one is stigma is a huge issue, and stigma around neurodiversity, stigma around sexual identity, gender identity is really big. We know looking at some of the research is not only does having a minority identity lead to risk of worsened mental health issues because of discrimination, prejudice, harassment, violence, and internalization of negative thoughts, but also just the awareness that there is a stigma or that people think negatively about you, that is an independent risk factor for negative mental health. And so it's challenging in a lot of ways. I think instead of for clinicians out there, instead of focusing on the percentages, 60% of depression, 60% of anxiety. To me, it's more important to track back and ask why. Why is this happening? Why is this occurring? And largely, if you ask that question, in a lot of cases, it's because of those things which I just mentioned. So what we describe as minority stress. the prejudice, harassment, and internalization of negative thoughts like something is wrong with me. I'm different and it's bad. Those
Mm-hmm.
types of thoughts.
Yeah, and the more that you mask that, the more that you hide that. And
Totally.
masking is spoken a lot. I mean, in the autistic community, it's something that people talk about all the time. It's about, how the feeling that they have to mask is pretty prevalent and kind of the experience. Those are, but I would imagine it's the same in the LGBTQ communities. Is at times it's like, I can't necessarily be my authentic self all the
Absolutely.
time because I feel like, somebody might look at me differently or make me feel less than, or I mean, whatever might occur from that. And that's got to play some huge dividends in just the way that someone is able to, cope, the way that they're able to be resilient. Because the more you're beaten down, the harder it is to get back up, right?
Right. Well,
So
and is it
go
even to
ahead.
add on that, sorry to interrupt, which is it's exhausting. So if you're
Hmm.
imagining you're masking neurodiversity in different areas, whether it be school or among friendships or work environments, and then you're also having to mask or having to conceal your sexual or gender identity, having to use your brain to switch, okay, which environment is this acceptable in? Which environment do I need to maybe hide this a little bit more? Um, in a lot of ways, in you add on another topic, which might be racial identities or ethnic identities, religious identities, whatever it might be. For individuals with many intersectional identities, it can just be exhausting.
Hmm. Yep. And I mean, the more that you're exhausted, the less that you're going to be able to kind of speak up for yourself, the less self-advocacy, the less you're going to go seek a community. But I know that you're out there educating on these topics. And I would imagine one of the biggest things is how to create a supportive community, how to find a supportive community, because that seems like where your empowerment is going to be fostered and that you're going to be able to kind of build those skills, the trust and the ability to be yourself. But is that the focus of your education, or where do you go when you're trying to be able to help others to be more aware?
So I think of education in different spheres. So in terms of the education that I do with the medical school or with trainees, that education is more about what we just talked about, understanding minority stress, understanding how these chronic stressors can appear in people's lives, how they can increase risk for mental health disorders. Because I don't want people just to stop at oh, this person is autistic or this person is LGBTQ, therefore they have all of these quote unquote problems. When I educate, it's different from when I educate families, in which families are the number one most important relationship in a child's life, undoubtedly. And the way that families come to support their children, whether it be identity, whether it be physical, mental health disabilities, is so important. And so one of the things that I educate families on is when we look at the research, family support is the most important factor in terms of reducing risk for both psychiatric illness and importantly, suicide attempts. So if LGBTQ kids come from very accepting families, their suicide attempt risk actually goes down by greater than 8 times. They have 8 times less risk of attempting suicide. If we look at children that come from very supportive families, 92% of them think they can be a happy adult, which is fantastic. 92%, that's a huge number. At Conversely, we know that if children come from very rejecting families, then of course, mental health is much, much worse.
Hmm. And I mean, the empowerment of families is the role of a physician is not just providing that medical care. That my wife's a physician, and I know that I would say 70% of what she's doing is listening, is being compassionate, is being able to understand all of the factors that are involved, being able to understand, the goals of that particular patient. When you are working with the physician group, because they have to be the ones to empower the families as well. Families don't know all the answers. They know their own experience. And
Right.
it gets that talking. But are you coaching? Are you educating on the idea of empathetic care, compassionate care, active listening through those experiences to really pull from those visits and really help to put families on the right path?
And when you're speaking of empathic care, are we speaking about providers or are we speaking about families?
Coaching the providers and
Right.
educating
Right.
them through their medical training. I would
Right.
imagine that's got to be a huge component. I don't know how often it's hit during the training process,
Right.
but to be a good doctor, that's almost a requirement in my mind.
I think it varies. It definitely varies school to school. And I think it's influenced by local politics, by national politics. I know at least within the medical school at UCLA, there is a strong emphasis on patient-centered care. How do we affirm patients? And it could include use of their name, their preferred name or nickname, and their use of pronouns. I think it is so important because it sets the stage right away. If in any part of the medical encounter, whether it be the front desk, whether it be the person taking the vitals, the appointment line, if somebody is misgendered, which we know this happens all the time, um, that sets the tone for a negative encounter. People might be more apprehensive. And from the data, we know that when misgendering happens, people are less likely to seek care. So they put off preventative care visits. So they health conditions get worse and they present, later in life with much worse conditions. So uh, part of the education with providers is saying we have to figure out a way to affirm people every step along the way. And this is not about one being on one side or the other. It's really about just a baseline respect. It is
Mm-hmm.
about using somebody's name and using what they prefer to be called, whether that's a first name or a nickname, which again sets the tone for the entire encounter.
Mm-hmm. And I'm a strong believer in the fact that when somebody comes into my office, to anybody's office, is that they're coming in with the experience of I know how I feel. I know my perception of everything. I know my perspective. When you have a child who identifies as LGBTQ and you've never had that experience, or you have a child who is neurodiverse and you've never had that thought process or thought pattern before,
Right.
it's okay to admit to that, to knowing I'm not prepared, to be said, to ask all the questions. Is that something that you're saying to families? Ask every question, get as much information, find a community that's asking the same questions. That parent caregiver community, at least in the autistic community, is huge. It's a wonderful resource. But do you
Absolutely.
see it in both fields?
Well, so there's a couple of big topics that I think you are bringing up. One is, and correct me if I'm wrong. So I'm actually going to answer the second part first, which is um, how when families present, how do we talk to families about this issue? One of the things that may be very difficult is that oftentimes there's a disconnect between what the child is seeking help for and what the child wants to focus on versus the family and the parents. In a lot of families with the diagnosis of autism, families can get behind that. They understand that as a medical condition. They understand that there's treatments, and often these families go above and beyond to pursue those. When we get to the issue of gender diversity or a kid being trans or non-binary, um, if a kid also happens to have autism, the priorities can be very different, and we see this very often. So oftentimes parents want to seek care for autism related behavioral issues, care support, whereas the kid is presenting saying, I really want to speak about this gender piece. I
Hmm.
understand I have autism. I'm okay with that. I'm working through it, but this piece is really what's most important. And so oftentimes there is this conflict and this tension between, what is the priority? What do we want to focus on first? And so I see my role as not to tell parents how to parent, not to tell parents you should do this with your child. That is absolutely not my role. My role is to say, you are coming to me with a question, with a problem. I am going to use my education expertise to explain or give a perspective on what is driving it and what things can get better. At the
Hmm.
end of the day, families are the decision makers for their child. That being said, my role is also to be an advocate for my patients. And so I can hopefully bring voice to the child, when families are considering all of these different avenues.
And I have an assumption, and it might be a poor assumption, but
There's,
when you're talking about gender identity and you're talking about a family who has a child who's neurodiverse,
yep.
is that I would imagine that there is a good number of families that come in with the idea that their child who's trying to understand the world around them is just confused, will develop out of it, will, I mean, say, I mean, I would imagine that you have a thought process led by the fact that somebody's neurodiverse and maybe some of the common misperceptions of that, or of that leading to a decision-making process on gender identity. Is that a wrong assumption by me?
No, absolutely not. And I think it is complicated by so individuals with autism. One of the highest things that also comes along with it is intellectual disability. So there is some consideration in terms of what is the cognitive level of this individual. What I see more often, however, is individuals who have autism, but might be on the quote unquote higher functioning end of the spectrum, meaning that they don't have intellectual disability, they're fully verbal. Um, when it comes to decision making, I think one of the pieces of education is really going back to the what are the small affirming steps we can make. I've had a number of families who have um, come in because their child is identifying as trans or non-binary, and families are saying, I don't know what to do with this. Two, is this a phase? Or even this is this is incorrect, or this is something I don't believe in. In those cases, my goal is to try to understand what are the kids' concerns, what are the family's concerns, and come to a shared understanding. I will say in 99.9% of cases, families who come in at any stage, when we talk about gender identity, and I ask, what do you want for your child in the future? Putting everything aside, what do you hope for in terms of things you want for your child's future? 99.9% of the time, families will say, I want my child to be happy, healthy, plus or minus live independently or have relationships.
Hmm.
If with that understanding, I can always agree to that and say, I want the exact same thing for your child. When we talk about happiness, if we affirm or use and accept different parts of our child's identity, they're more likely to be happy.
Hmm.
If we affirm these things, they're more likely to have or less likely to have mental health issues and be healthy. if we are able to establish a relationship with your child in which your child feels accepted and loved for all parts of them, that sets the template for relationships for the rest of their life.
Hmm.
And so once we get to that point, parents typically say, okay, these are steps I'm willing to take and I'm take it and listen, take that journey with you because I'm not approaching it as in your child is trans. They should be on hormones. They need to go there. They need to go there. But it's really understanding what are our fears and how do we get to where we want to be.
Absolutely. And the description of happiness is, I mean, when I talk to families, it's very similar to what you're hearing. Everybody has very common life goals. The roadmap to getting there for each person is so different. But the idea of affirming care, especially with neurodiversity,
Yep.
it's unfortunately relatively new. Now you're looking at neuroaffirming care with neurodiversity and gender diversity, and it's something that is going to take time for people to get good at. So what is the one thing that you wish, if you were to wave that wand and say, all right, I wish everybody were able just to understand this one piece of information about the intersection of autism and LGBTQ identities, what's the one thing that you would think, this would be a game changer?
Ooh, only one thing.
Only
Um,
one thing.
okay, if it's only one thing, I'm gonna start very broad, which is if I wanted everybody to know one thing, is right now being a kid is really hard. This extends to families, which families talk about how it was for them growing up. It's a whole different ballgame with social media and electronics. The average teen spends 8 hours a day on social media. And that's not only where they make relationships, that's where they have to present themselves. They have to formulate a quote unquote brand. That in addition to, they hire academic stressors. Then we get over to the issue of LGBTQ identities, and there's a lot going on right now. So half of kids who identify as trans live in a state with a policy or a law against them, whether it is participation in sports, whether it is use of bathrooms, whether it is receiving any sort of medical care for gender identity. Um, for for those kids, it's been really tough. Lesser known is recent policies of removing, an LGBTQ option of the suicide hotline, defunding that. And so being a kid is really tough. Being a trans or non-binary or LGBTQ kid is even more challenging. And then you add neurodiversity on top of that, and it can be really challenging. It can be a really challenging environment for a kid.
And taking that step back and just going full circle to what you spoke to when we originally started about how when you're feeling as if you are marginalized in so many different areas,
Yeah.
your mental health and even how you feel about yourself starts to be affected over time. And I would imagine, like you said, social media is going to do that. You feel like you're under the radar constantly, hearing in the news specific policies and just even watching the world around you and how they're thinking about you. It should affect you. I mean, it should make you very upset if you feel like you're being marginalized in those particular areas. Um, but it's real. And I think for families to understand that and for the community to understand that, I think that's a part of, how to be able to empower somebody is to start to kind of break down some of those barriers. But what is and I appreciate, I mean, just the thoughts that you brought up today, Dr. Ito. I mean, I think that it's putting it out there to say to everybody is that we have to be compassionate, we have to be aware, we have to be thoughtful, which are all wonderful things, whether or not we're talking about diversity or whether we're talking about just being wonderful humans. It's all the same characteristics. We just need to expand on them. But what's your message if you were to give a message to other healthcare providers about supporting these autistic youth with diverse identities right now? You had mentioned is that the one thing that you'd want everybody to know is, as that's very hard. What would you be saying on the level of healthcare and being that first line of defense for so many people that are trying to really understand themselves?
What I would say is that as healthcare providers, we can play a huge role in understanding both making people feel understood, but also helping families. If I were to say what I would want providers to know, I would want providers to ask. So if you have gender diverse youth, ask about questions of social relationships. Ask about questions related to symptoms that may be related to autism. If you are seeing a kid who has autism, asking, have you thought about relationships? Have you thought about your gender identity? And tell me a little bit about that, attractions. We know that within the autism community, providers ask less, educate and counsel less about sex, just in general, and sexual health. And families talk about sex less often with their autistic youth. So first would be to ask. Second would be to listen. When we look at data interviewing autistic youth who identify as trans, one of the things that stood out or that individuals say is they're worried about not being listened to. They're worried that because they have autism, that people won't listen to their perspectives on gender. And unfortunately, we see that being true. One of the most dangerous consequences of it is there's been some recent legislation actually in different states in which gender affirming care is being banned on the premise that more of these children have autism and therefore have a disability, have a mental illness, and cannot make decisions about gender. That's very dangerous. So the second one would be to listen. And if a kid or an adolescent is endorsing a gender diverse identity, listen and explore that. The third biggest message would be to advocate. And advocacy can take a lot of different shapes and forms. Doesn't mean you have to be out there with, at a protest with a big sign. It means educating yourself on these issues, understanding how the community and the national stage might be affecting, the individuals you work with, and make those steps to affirm people, to step in, to teach people how do we deal with harassment, how do we deal with prejudice when it comes up, because I think that can be really powerful in arming our kids.
Well, and the advocacy that you're doing right now, just by educating, and whether that's educating providers, whether that's educating through a podcast or talking with families, I think that that's extremely powerful. So I appreciate the time that you've spent with us today. I think that it'll bring up really good conversation. And quite frankly, I think that a conversation alone is a form of advocacy. It gets people talking, it gets people listening, it gets the ideas out there, which is extremely healthy in a world that seems a little bit more closed to having difficult conversations. So thank you for coming on today, Dr. Rita.
I appreciate it. I appreciate you highlighting this topic.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.